ladies and gentlemen, we welcome you all to the book discussion in the series IHC Conversations with Authors, presented by the Habitat Library and Resource Center. On behalf of India Habitat Center, we extend a warm welcome to the author for this evening, Ambassador Satish Chandra. We welcome Dr. Arvind Gupta, the director of the Vivekananda International Foundation, New Delhi, who will be in conversation with Ambassador Satish Chandra. We welcome the President of India Habitat Center, Ambassador Bhaswati Mukherjee. Thank you so much, ma'am, for taking out the time out of your busy schedule to chair this session. Ambassador Satish Chandra, whose book, A Life Well Spent, 4 Decades in the Indian Foreign Service, is being featured in the today's discussion, joined the Indian Foreign Service in 1965, and till 1989 he was posted in various capacities in Indian missions in Vienna, Karachi, Washington DC, Algiers, and Dhaka, as well as the headquarters. Subsequently, he served as India's ambassador to the Philippines, his permanent representative to the UN offices in Geneva, and its High Commissioner to Pakistan. He set up the NSCS in 1999 and headed it as a secretary till demission from the office in Feb 2005, concurrently holding the post of Deputy National Security Advisor from February 2002. Apart from representing India at a variety of multilateral fora, he served as the president of Conference on Disarmament during his assignment in Geneva. He was the president of the Association of Indian Diplomats in 2010. He has been associated with Vivekananda International Foundation since its inception in 2009, and it's currently the vice chairman of its executive committee. Dr. Arvind Gupta was the Deputy National Security Advisor and Secretary, National Security Council, Government of India. Earlier, he was the Director General of the Institute for Defence Studies and Analysis, Ministry of Defence, New Delhi. As a former career diplomat, he has served in the Ministry of External Affairs and Indian missions abroad. He is a member of the Board of Studies of the School of International Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University and has honorary academic positions at the Punjab University and Andhra University. Dr. Gupta has to his credit the following books: Opportunity for India in a Changing World, How India Manages Its National Security, India's Foreign Policy, Surviving in a Turbulent World, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, The Relevance of India's Ancient Thinking to Contemporary Strategic Reality. The session will be chaired by the President of India Habitat Center, Ambassador Bhaswati Mukherjee. Ambassador Mukherjee is a seasoned Indian diplomat with a distinguished career in India's foreign service. She has served as India's permanent representative to UNESCO in Paris, Ambassador of India to the Netherlands, and held numerous senior diplomatic positions. Ambassador Mukherjee is known for her expertise in multilateral diplomacy, global governance, and cultural heritage preservation. In addition to her diplomatic work, she has authored insightful best-selling books on the EU, Bengal's partition, and the root of India's forgotten children, the indentured. May I now invite the author, Ambassador Satish Chandra, Dr. Arvind Gupta, and President-IHC Ambassador Bhaswati Mukherjee to please come to the dais, and then I request Madam President for her opening remarks. Thank you so much.
Ambassador Satish Chandra, Ambassador Ronenson, my dear colleague and friend, Ambassador Arvind Gupta, all of you here. When Bhavna was making the introduction, I remembered the time when we had a discussion on my book in IIC, and my batchmate, Ambassador Pavan Verma, humorously said, "Gosh, this is a very incestuous panel of only foreign service people." And so I think, while not wanting to use the word incestuous, I must say it's a very foreign service panel. It's a pleasure for me to introduce the book, A Life Well Spent, because I had the privilege of working very closely with Ambassador Satish Chandra when he was PR Geneva, and I was chef de cabinet to the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and later, when he was the head of the Indian delegation to the Vienna World Conference on Human Rights, I was the secretary of the drafting committee with the legendary Ambassador Saboya of Brazil, where we successfully negotiated a document which still hands today as the premier document on human rights of 100 paras. It's called the Vienna Declaration and Program of Action. Ambassador Satish Chandra in Geneva used to call me his mole. So when I was told that he has cited me in this book, in chapter 11 on page 131, I became very nervous and quickly turned to it. Fortunately, he hasn't referred to me as the mole, but in a slightly more diplomatic language. But in reality, I would have to say in all frankness that I really was his mole, because we were going through a very difficult time when he was PR Geneva. The Pakistanis were extremely aggressive. This was the time when there was a perfect political understanding between the opposition in India and the ruling party. And so many of the delegations that used to come to defend India in Geneva used to consist of the best and the brightest on both sides of the political divide, and both defended India with the same emotion and same articulation. Unfortunately, that is not possible. I hope it will come back one day. Ambassador Satish Chandra's time in Geneva was extremely stressful, as it was for all of us. It came at a time when the Pakistanis tried to introduce a resolution on Kashmir in the Human Rights Council, it was called at that time, Human Rights Commission. And we had a heavyweight delegation consisting of leader of the opposition, Atal Bihari Vajpayee. We had Dr. Farooq Abdullah, who I can never forget his presentation on Kashmir. We had Dr. Salman Khurshid and many others. And as he says in his book, everyone was on the same page. Ultimately, Ambassador Satish Chandra successfully used his influence, legendary influence, on the Iranian ambassador, who then leaned on the Pakistanis to withdraw the resolution, because I still remember in numerous internal sessions that we had, which he's not referred in his book because he's still a quintessential bureaucrat, we were like going to win the no action motion by either one vote or two. And that is extremely tricky at a time when votes could be purchased through various means. And I regret to say that that is still possible today. Votes can be purchased to swing one way or the other. He hasn't spoken a lot about what happened in the negotiations leading up to the Vienna Declaration. So with his permission, I'm going to give you a little snippet of diplomatic life featuring around Ambassador Satish Chandra. When Ambassador Satish Chandra was PR Geneva, he was wearing two hats. Both were very important. One was on human rights, one was on conference on disarmament. He was ordered by the foreign secretary of the day to go to New York for the disarmament conference. I did tell him, though I was so much junior to him, I still, as his mole and devoted follower, told him, I said, sir, I think it's a very risky thing you're doing. He says, my dear girl, when you get an order from Delhi, you have to obey it. So he went to New York. And we were going to be finalizing the draft document for the Vienna Declaration to be sent to Vienna. There was one paragraph, which you can well imagine would always cause us problems. It's called self-determination of peoples. Now that's UN multilateral jargon, which he's talked about, that the mafia used to ill-treat him. I'm part of the mafia, but I've never ill-treated anyone. When you talk about people with S, it means that territory has to be liberated. So when you say self-determination of peoples, it means a part of a particular country is under colonial rule. So the Pakistani resolution was under self-determination of peoples, and it was couched in language which made it very clear that it was referring to both Palestine and Kashmir. When you're in the UN Secretariat, you can only be a mole. You can't directly intervene. The Indian delegation was sitting on the third row, and it was empty except for one China expert, a typical Bengali, intellectual, highly intellectual, as Bongs are, probably dreaming of the next mathematical equation that he's going to resolve when he goes home in his spare time. There was nobody else in India's desk, and the Pakistanis moved an amendment on the self-determination to insert Kashmir. The chairperson of the drafting committee was a very good friend of mine, a lady, Halima Warzazi of Morocco. And she told me in French, she says, there's nobody there on the Indian desk except one young man who looks as if he's sleeping. So I'll give you the text to read out loudly, maybe he'll wake up. So I read out the text once, and then twice. And then I read it out again for the third time. And the Pakistani ambassador said, "How many more times are you going to read it?" I said, "Sorry." Then Halima Warzazi said, "Any objections? If looks could kill, I would have killed that guy." Silence. It was passed. I came out of the room and telephoned him in New York. He was sleeping. In those days, there were no mobile phones. I said, "I told you, sir, you shouldn't have gone." He says, "What happened?" I said, "Kashmir is inside the Vienna Declaration and it's not in square brackets." Square brackets means disputed language. So he says, "Can't you at least put it in square brackets?" I said, "I will put it in square brackets." So I put it in square brackets without the Pakistanis finding out. And when he was sent back on a flight the very same afternoon by the same foreign secretary who sent him to New York, told him to catch the first flight back to Geneva. I went to the airport to receive him and he said, "Ab kya kare?" I said, "Sir, ab kya kare? You'll have to call for a vote on it. But first make sure we win the vote." That paragraph, as Ambassador Satish Chandra has diplomatically left out in his book, went all the way to Vienna, where I spent 3 weeks working from 7 in the morning to 4 in the morning. Pretty good stamina, you must agree, for the president of IHC, right? That paragraph was held up till the end by a master diplomat called Ambassador Saboya of Brazil, who became foreign secretary. And he told me, "There's only one way we can get it through." I said, "How?" He said, "You read it out at 4 o'clock in the morning when everybody is half dead, and we will give no lunch break either, and no dinner break." I said, "Sir, no lunch break, no dinner." He says, "No break. We will start at 3 o'clock and continue till the early hours of the morning." So at 3:45 in the morning, I read out the paragraph. Nobody objected to the deletion, which Ambassador Satish Chandra asked for the deletion. Nobody objected, and the Vienna Declaration was adopted at 4 a.m. So welcome to the world of multilateral, and welcome to Ambassador Satish Chandra's book. I think I've said enough, except to say that his real expertise is on Pakistan. He's had the most amazing relationships with the Pakistanis. He, unlike many other people from North India, have a perfect understanding of how to negotiate with Pakistanis. Because in the Foreign Service, it's a weakness that people imagine that those who are from Pakistan, Punjab, make the best high commissioners to Pakistan. And those who are from India and Bengal make the best high commissioners to Bangladesh. It's the opposite. We should always post a Bong to Pakistan and a Punjabi to Bangladesh. That's the way to handle it. It hasn't yet happened though. But he's an exception. He did amazing things for the India-Pakistan relationship. And he actually said a lot of things about what happened when we won the war, whether we lost a golden opportunity, etc. I leave that to him to describe. And also to say that it's very nice to have Arvind on the floor. Arvind and I ran the administrative branch of MEA together. I was MEA's first woman joint secretary administration, based on the sound principle that a woman is not fit to be secretary of the Foreign Service Board, which transfers people. That's a very male prerogative, right? So we shattered that glass ceiling, and between Arvind and myself, we also built 12 ladies' toilets in South Block, because until I became JSAD, in that huge and massive building, there were only men's toilets and only 2 ladies' toilets. On that basis, welcome to the discussion.
At the outset, let me first thank Bhaswati and the Habitat Center for having organized this event, this is a new development at the Habitat Center that they have started organizing talks by authors, particularly those who are members of the Habitat Center like myself, to listen to them. And I think this is all to the good. I'm also delighted that there are friends from the Foreign Service here. And it so happens that all of them here one has interacted with. Bhaswati, of course, was with me for 2 years, not working with me, but she was at the Center for Human Rights. She was the chef de cabinet of Ibrahim Fall, who was the director of the Center for Human Rights. And I don't belong to the UN mafia. My appointment, like most of my appointments in my career, which are brought out in my book, were accidental, as was my joining this service itself. So even my appointment to the UN was accidental, and I didn't fit the bill. And the reason why I was sent to Geneva to a UN assignment was because the then Foreign Secretary felt that there was a very nefarious UN mafia which must be broken. So there were non-UN people, and I was sent as PR Geneva, and he told me that very shortly Mr. Hamid Ansari, who later on became vice president, was sent as PR New York. And he said, this has been held against me in the service that I'm not a UN mafia people. So I don't want this. And I want to prove a point that good officers can also work effectively in the UN. So I was not really a UN guy, and her being there was helpful because I used her to get to know the inner workings of the Center for Human Rights, which we could leverage for our own purposes to be able to deal with it more effectively and efficiently. And she was immensely helpful. In fact, one got to know Ibrahim Fall, he came over home, etc., courtesy Bhaswati. And also the inner happenings there and how we could use certain mechanisms to promote our agenda, which was really to counter the Pakistani moves against us. And of course, the details of what happened subsequently, one will go into that later. So I'm glad Bhaswati here. I'm equally glad that Arvind is here because Arvind and I have been associated since 1986. He was then dealing with Afghanistan, and I joined as the Joint Secretary, and we worked together for 3 years in the Ministry of External Affairs. And then subsequently, I was offered, I had requested when the NSCS was being set up by the Prime Minister, and I asked Mr. Brijesh Mishra, I said, look, we are setting this up. Can't I have some officers of my choice? He said, you're allowed to select 2. Ultimately, he gave me only 1. And that one was, I had asked by name for Arvind. And then he joined the NSCS and has gone on to achieve great things in that organization. So my association with him has been ever since that time, from 1986 to date. So I'm glad to see the Biradri is here, elements of it with whom I've worked. And of course, with Ronen, everyone has worked with in one capacity or another in the External Affairs Ministry. Jayant, of course, was on certain very critical negotiations with the Americans in 2003 or thereabouts. And that too will come up when we discuss this. But I would really like to stop here because we are supposed to have a conversation. So let Arvind take the lead on that, and I'll be happy to answer questions. Thanks.
So I think my task has been made very easy with brilliant introduction from Bhaswati, and of course introductory remarks by Ambassador Chandra. And this is, I think, probably one of the most difficult things I'm doing for a very long time, because I have 3 bosses, my former bosses sitting here. 1, 2, and 3. Ambassador Ronan Sen. So talking to the bosses and asking them questions publicly is not going to be very easy. But I think let's come to the book. Firstly, this book, I very strongly urge, and I think some youngsters are also here, probably aspiring to become diplomats. What is the diplomatic life? What is like Indian Foreign Service? 40 years of its evolution, which he spent. Tremendous, so many anecdotes, and everybody thinks it's a very easy life. And you might get that impression if you read that book in parts, particularly when he narrates how he was taken to some wonderful restaurants in Vienna, and the music and so on. But also the hard work, which Bhaswati just said, and I'll come to Pakistan in a moment. So this mixture of hard and soft, and I think all working to a purpose. The purpose for which you work, I think that's what gives you the great joy. And this is very clear. The title of the book, A Life Well Spent. And the photograph, you think that is really the golf courses and the restaurants and the operas and so on. But when you say 4 decades in the Indian Foreign Service, you find a lot of things. It's a very, very interesting place, but also a very difficult place. And some of these difficulties were just mentioned. So let me begin, sir, firstly by congratulating you. I think you've done a great service by writing this book. A lot of us are writing these days. Everything is adding to that. So this is another addition to it. But I think your book has several focal points, and one of them is the Indian Foreign Service itself. So maybe I'll talk a little bit about that. But before I come to that, if you could briefly tell, and you just briefly touched upon it, what is it that motivates a retired ambassador to write a book? You didn't write it for a very long time. I remember many years ago, you used to say, if you write, you probably write on human rights, the kind of things that she narrated. But you ended up writing a book covering all your life. So maybe you could just explain the motivation behind writing this book.
Okay. Yes, I'm glad you asked this question. And really the fact is that it's always bothered me a great deal talking to people that no one really understands our foreign service and what life in the Indian Foreign Service is all about. I remember I joined around 60 years ago. And at that point in time, people didn't know very much about the Foreign Service. And in fact, as probationers, we went to, we go on Bharat Darshan. And we had gone to Jaipur, and a reservation had been made for us at the rest house there. And when we went there, we found nothing available. And then one of my colleagues tried to throw his bait about and said that, I belong to the IFS. And they said, well, what is the IFS? Indian Forest Service. It's nothing. Either you should be in the IAS or the IPS. I mean, these are services which deliver, and maybe we'll give you a couple of rooms or 3 rooms, which is what was our requirement. But Indian Foreign Service, no one knew about. And also talking to even friends and relatives, it's the easy life, lot of good wine and fun and games, but you don't do anything substantive. That's done by the IPS and the IAS and so on, Indian Railway Service maybe. So no one actually understood the Foreign Service, and a lot of people had continuously the notion that this is all glamour and glitz. Yes, there is a lot of glamour and glitz, and I'll be honest, I enjoy the glamour and glitz. I love the golf, I love good wine, I love good living, and I've had my share of it. But I think equally, it is a lot of hard work, even dangerous work, in situations where there's actually threat to life and limb, actually where you can make a difference, as she related on the Geneva experience, for example. It meant, apart from the various human rights conferences that took place, which lasted deep into the night. At Vienna, one did not sleep for 3 weeks, which was the duration of the conference, because you had to be present constantly to avert a resolution against you. Now, people may say, well, so what if there's a resolution? Let me tell you the consequences of it. Supposing there had been a resolution on self-determination in Kashmir, and this resolution was moved first in 1993, and there it really didn't come to the table, but it came to the table in 1994. Remember the time in Kashmir in 1994. The time in Kashmir in 1994 was the height of terrorism. And in fact, this had been prepared for this resolution by Pakistan. Supposing they had succeeded, it would not only have aggravated the situation in Kashmir, but it would have led to resolutions going into the UN General Assembly and the UN Security Council, ultimately. This would have been the natural progression. So it was imperative. It was, for me, a life and death matter to ensure that there is no resolution and it is defeated. And we did many things, and that we can discuss later. But my purpose for writing the book, which is what Arvind asked, was to give people, through my experiences, what the service is all about and how much hard work it means, and particularly for the younger people here, to look at it as a possible career option. Frankly, when I joined, it was my father told me to join it, so I joined it, because I didn't know what it is all about. But I think today you have, the young people here have many, many choices. And the Foreign Service is a great career because it gives you an opportunity to do a great deal.
Yeah, I think this is a follow-up question, and which is that you spent 4 decades. And after that also, you've been kind of in touch with it. In those 4 decades, you joined in 60s. I think that would... 66. In this time, how has the service changed?
Yeah, I think the service has changed a great deal. Arvind, when I joined it, I was very fortunate. I've been very fortunate all my life, actually. But when I joined it in terms of mentoring, I was very fortunate because the service was just in a very formative stage. To give you an idea, the service had a total strength at that time of around 300, of which only 170 or thereabouts were direct recruits from the UPSC. Ours was a mongrel service. We had 0 esprit de corps at that point in time. And the mentoring came from Mr. N. Krishnan, who was the secretary of the Pillay Committee. I, as a probationer in 1965, didn't go to Mussoorie, and I've explained why. I came to Delhi at headquarters and was attached to the Pillay Committee, which was going into foreign service reforms. And Sir N.R. Pillay, who was the chairman, would come down often and talk to us. And the one point he made consistently, the committee would suggest to him, improve the allowances, which is normal, improve the service conditions, which is normal. And he said, look, all this is okay, we will make those recommendations. But no matter what you do, unless there is an esprit de corps, you will achieve nothing. And we quizzed him. We said, what do you mean by that? He said, what I mean by that is that no matter who gets into the service, by the very nature of the service, either the individual, you will upgrade him if he is substandard, that is, he improves himself, but if he doesn't, you dismiss him. So only an elite in terms of ability, should be in the service, and there should be a camaraderie. Now, you mentioned how has it changed. One of the major changes has been that today it is no longer a mongrel service. At the time I joined, 170 or thereabout were direct UPSC recruits who had a direct loyalty and connect with each other. But there were people from the Indian Civil Service, the old ICS. There were people from the Information Service of India. There were from the Army, Navy, lot of lateral entry, and at different ages. We all, at my time, we came in between 21 and 24. So we were, there was a certain linkage, and I could see it because the mentoring I mentioned, in Krishnan 1951 batch, he was 14 years senior to me when I joined and went to the Pillai committee. He was a director. He had a lovely room on the first floor in South Dock, a huge room which now additional secretaries and secretaries maybe occupy. It was that room. We sat in that room for 3 or 4 months. We used to listen to him. We had discussions with him. We were put on work there. There were another colleague, Rajinder Rai, my batchmate, who actually wrote up elements of that report. And I did the donkey work, which I enjoyed, which was actually to look at the personal files of all officers in the service, to compile all the tabular statements in the Pillai committee were actually done by me after discussions with Krishnan and Rajinder Rai. Now, this constant conversations that we had was a wonderful mentoring experience that I went through. And this was followed up in Vienna, my first posting, foreign posting, with Mr. Dixit, who was the first secretary. And it was a very different type of training that is given to most people even then, because most young officers, when they are posted abroad, it's a language training. You go to the country and you spend 2 years or thereabouts learning a language. Well, I had to learn the language, but Mr. Dixit said this language is your business, which you shall pass in 1.5 years. But you shall do a full day's job in office. And I really welcomed it because I learned very fast the entire embassy operations, which are there for me. Now, one other thing I want to make on this point, how it has changed. Let me answer this. I think today, in many ways, we are much better equipped because not only is there greater uniformity in the service in terms of the selection module, you have your own internal training institution. Earlier, we all went to, of course, they still go to Lal Bahadur Shastri, but you have your own Foreign Service Training Institute, which exists, which imparts training tailored to your requirements of the Foreign Service. But yet, I'll say that the basic reforms that NR Pillai committees suggested were not implemented. One of the most important reforms was that double the strength of the service within 10 years. That is, raise it from 300 to around 600. And it didn't happen for a very, very long time. Even now, I think it's grossly understaffed. Second thing he recommended was there should be a Secretary General. That post was abolished around 63 or 64. You don't have a Secretary General. Another thing he recommended is have a very powerful policy planning division, which is imperative. It's iffy at the moment, I think, but others will know better.
Of course, since then, the kind of things that we do, the remit has also expanded. Today, you're doing economic diplomacy, you're doing technology, you're doing so many other things which were not simply there. And perhaps today, the professional inputs are extremely important, which perhaps were not there at that point of time. But let me come to your...
Well, Arvind, just to comment on this, okay. And you'll bear me out on this because both of us do work out together at the Vivekananda International Foundation, and we have had interaction with officers of Joint Secretary level and above from MEA, from Ministry of External Affairs. And it is my distinct impression that quality is excellent. And in some ways, certainly comparing myself, I think they were much better today than what I was when I was their age. And partly for what you said is that diplomacy, now the remit has expanded, the exposure is much greater, India has a much bigger footprint. So their knowledge base and their capacities are better than what certainly mine were.
So, sir, as Bhaswati also said, you have dealt with Pakistan for a very long time. I think half your service you did Pakistan. And I know that Pakistan is something that you continue to focus, not only Pakistan, but also neighborhood, but Pakistan. Now, it is arguably the worst relationship that we have. And you have, so what is, you think, the reason? And is there any way to improve it? You know, you mentioned in your book that they have an anti-India mindset. Basically, what you're saying is you're ruling out any improvement in India-Pakistan relations. This is in their DNA. And you have said it many times, even in writing, you have said, your various articles and so on. So, what do we do with Pakistan?
Yeah, this is I have also prescribed a solution, which many think, most think, and I am a minority, most think it is a drastic solution. Yes, it is a drastic solution. Really, it's very sad for me because I hail from that part of the world. I come from Multan. My mother was from Multan city and my father from Sikandrabad. And we've come from there. And in the earlier years, one did attempt very hard, even as late as the time one was High Commissioner in Pakistan, to get some sort of a meaningful dialogue going. But as one analyzed it over the years, it doesn't work out. You see, I don't think any country has done as much as has India for Pakistan, and any country been treated so badly as India by a country for which so much has been done by Pakistan. You look at the things that have been done, and I have quoted a whole lot of them. If you look at the Simla Agreement, it was the most generous possible agreement that any victor country could conclude with a vanquished. We gave up territory, we gave up POWs, and we didn't even settle Kashmir, which we could have. If you look at the very inception of Pakistan, which is not mentioned in this book, but I'm writing another one which you should read, which will be published by VIF shortly, which is on India-Pakistan directly. You look at the debt resettlement and the payments that we made to Pakistan at the time of independence. Huge amounts of money were given to Pakistan. And we were not exactly resource rich. And you look at the debt we took on for Pakistan, which is in excess of 300 crores today, still unpaid. So they have not, take the Indus Waters Treaty, you don't have to go very far. And the Indus Waters Treaty is a classic example of India's magnanimity, some may say stupidity. But certainly magnanimity. The Indus Basin waters in India source is around 40%. What we get out of the treaty for India is 20%. Now tell me, where is the justice? Okay, even this is fine. What does Pakistan do? Every project that we put up, which under the treaty, which was badly concluded, we have to get Pakistan's acceptance for projects on the Western rivers, and the Western river projects are very small in nature by virtue of the treaty. But we are allowed a few. Those are delayed by decades because Pakistan won't approve them. And nowadays, from 2007 onwards, they have started taking it for neutral experts and arbitration. So, you don't gain anywhere. So my point is this, and I've gone on to prove in the book that there is actually a DNA problem. And I'll just narrate a little story to you. Take terrorism, for example, which Pakistan has bred in its country, and it's hurting it very badly today. In that context, I told some of the Pakistanis whom I knew when I was High Commissioner there, that look, don't do things which hurt you. You're doing this, it's hurting you. He said, it really doesn't matter. Isn't it hurting you? I said, yes, it is. He said, so long as it's hurting you, it's okay. We don't mind if we go down the tubes, but we are taking you down the tubes as well. You know, that is the raison d'etre of that state. And therefore, my short answer is that you don't have to do anything very much in dealing with Pakistan. They are going through a process of disintegration. Facilitate that process. You don't have to move a single soldier. You don't really have to do anything. But you can help this process. And that country, we were having a discussion today in VIF. I was there also online. And the situation there is very, very bad. Economically, politically, in security-wise, terrorist incidents. And Baluchistan wants to break away. Sindh is not far away. The Pashtuns hate the Punjabis. And they are in deep trouble, so help them. I mean, the country needs this sort of help, so let's facilitate the
Actually,
process.
there are so many things that we could discuss, but shortage of time, I have to move on. But let me come to a connected thing, which is also connected with Pakistan, but a different phase, which is the Kargil. You were the secretary to the Kargil Review Committee. I was with you at that time in the NSCS. We held so many discussions. We got to know what the Pakistanis were doing and what were the weaknesses in our system. Then the group of ministers report was given, and you were the one who piloted it. And then, so can you share some experience of yours about the NSC? Why was it set up? Was it useful? And you straight got into the Kargil at that point of time. And then you also got into the drafting of the nuclear doctrine. Of course, Jayant is also here. He has dealt with these issues very intimately. But maybe if you could share some experience of Kargil, the GOM report, and the nuclear doctrine.
Well, yeah, please.
I was Joint Secretary West Europe when Kargil happened. And I went with the then External Affairs Minister, Jaswant Singh Ji, to the airport to receive the mutilated and tortured bodies of our officers and Jawans who were betrayed, killed mercilessly after torture and sent back. And Jaswant Singh Ji insisted on wearing his uniform. And he said he wouldn't allow me to go in to see the bodies. He said, Kargil, to him, he said, was the final betrayal. Then I thought to myself, well, he's a Rajput, so he's saying it's a final betrayal. The final betrayal happened with partition. And how many more times are we going to get betrayed? So on that, in that context, sir, if you could comment on Kargil. Thank you.
Yeah, well, you know, actually the Kargil story is the old story with Pakistan. I mean, they've done this again and again. Kashmir in 1947. They had a Pakistani army-inspired movement into Kashmir. The soldiers actually were there, apart from the tribals. They did that. In 1965, again, a repetition of that. The constant use of terror against us through the 90s. And why? I mean, as in the next book that I am doing, I have done a chapter on terrorism. It's not just in Kashmir, it's in Punjab, it was in the Northeast. It has a pan-India dimension. So they are out to destroy us. And Kargil was one element of this, and really not too different. Originally, they were able to fool us to the extent that people felt that it is a Mujahideen thing, whereas that was quite wrong. And as George Verghese put it, because he wrote the introduction to the Kargil Review Committee report, he said these were Pakistani soldiers in fancy dress. Okay. But we did believe it, and the army believed it. And now, coming to the specific point he made, which I recall very distinctly, I got to know about this on the 4th or 5th of May. that something had happened. And this were certain briefings that we used to get regularly from various intelligence outfits. And some of them said, this is happening. Others didn't believe it. But within 3 days of that date, this hit the fan that something had happened. But it wasn't till around the 20th or 25th of May until there was active conflict, really, that we really realized that they were in fact soldiers. And the whole Kargil exercise, much has been made out even in the Kargil Review Committee report, and I have a slightly different idea on some of the projections in the report that were made. And that is really that this particular action that was there was a stupid action on the part of the Pakistanis, because there was hardly any major influx of troops into the area opposite Kargil. They moved only one additional battalion, and therefore the pickup by intelligence was really not possible that this is going to happen. And a lot of controversy has been there. It's my belief that really it was not detectable for this sort of operation, because to do that, you would have had to have very, very good tech int, which we did not have, and equipment like very good helicopters. Our helicopters did fly over the incursion zones, but missed the movement of these elements that had got in. So really, it wasn't feasible to detect it in advance. Patrolling was impossible in that climate, in that temperature, because patrol parties had been sent. We saw the reports. What the Pakistanis did because of this stupid action was to take very heavy casualties, and this is in the diaries that we saw of the soldiers which came to us, and we saw the diaries of how many deaths have been caused because of their moving in avalanche life conditions. Our patrolling was not possible unless we were prepared to let people die, and that was not our policy. So it was not detectable, and it was not a sustainable operation. And that is the reason why, one of the reasons why we were able to address them. Of course, there can be criticism of how we addressed it, and I think hats off to our young officers, and we interviewed many of them at Kargil. We went there. And amazing tales of bravery, of the manner in which they were able to dislodge the Pakistani intruders, and these were soldiers, not mujahideen. We used equipment like Bofors, etc., to deal with them. But there were other ways to have dealt with them, and some of these suggestions that were made were not taken. One of the suggestions was, for instance, that you cross the LOC elsewhere. Because taking them frontally, if you visit Kargil and all those Tiger Hill and all those points, they are frightening places to be operating in, and very, very dangerous. So to address a Pakistani attack of this nature in a sector like Kargil, a much safer option and more effective option is to, it's just like what we did in 65 conflict. We opened the Sialkot, Lahore sector completely. Yeah.
The problem, sir, was that the Indian Air Force wanted to cross the LOC. It was Air Chief Marshal Tipnis. And he also explained that it is not possible for the Indian Air Force at 30,000 feet to know exactly where is the LOC. So he vociferously protested. But this was a stipulation which came directly from the White House. And that's a fact.
No.
They said that it was a stipulation.
Let me add this. There was another suggestion made by another group, which was a good suggestion, is that you bomb them. Now, the problem with our Air Force was, and this was a problem imposed by our own people, by the government of India, is that they were to operate in a corridor and not cross the LOC. Now, that is what led to those accidents that happened.
May come in here, just a little. I recently read a book on the Air Force operations in 1947-48.
Yep.
I was mentioning to you about this. And there were several things, but at that time also they had occupied Kargil. And that time also the Indian Air Force went into that. And the hills, etc., that they attack, exactly the same. I don't think when the Air Force undertook operations in Kargil in 99, they ever read those records, or even if they were available. Because this book was written a little later by one of the Air Force officers. So it was a deja vu, in fact. If they had read those things, they would have handled this thing much better.
No, the problem.
And also this corridor thing. Again, there was this self-imposed limit.
Exactly.
1947, they say that you don't go, keep your operations only 3 kilometers of the border. That was India-Pakistan.
Vertical takeoff.
And vertical takeoff, because that could be for various reasons. So I think we haven't learned from the
No,
lessons.
and this was, I think, not a good option to get your armed forces to fight with their
Yes.
hands tied.
Too many
behind their back.
restrictions.
Too many restrictions, and this caused enormous problems.
But coming to, yeah, we're finishing the thing. I think we'll end it here with one last question, which could, there are many things actually to talk about. Unfortunately, we don't have the time. But what do you think are the challenges to current challenges to diplomacy?
I frankly, I've said this earlier, hats off to what the government has achieved. We are in an enormously complex situation with the Ukraine conflict, with the conflict in the Middle East, with your China problem, with the countries like USA and so forth. But I think this is deft maneuvering which has been done. It will have to be continued. Of course, we are better placed today than we were in the 90s. I mean, when Bhaswati and myself were in the UN system, India was in the doghouse. We were mortgaging our gold, which was being flown out to the UK. And we counted for very little. The pressures on us were huge. Today also we face pressures and difficulties and challenges. But I think India's heft has undoubtedly increased because you are economically much stronger. And really any country's foreign policy capability is a function usually of its internal strength, particularly economic strength. And I think, therefore, we are well equipped, I think better equipped than we were ever in the past to face the challenges. However, I do admit that it's not a straightforward world. During the Cold War, when Ronen and Bhaswati and others were dealing with the situation, it was fairly cut and dried. It's no longer cut and dried. And then you have the technological problems also that are there. So it's enormously complex. You can go wrong anytime. But I have complete confidence in the current systems and the current dispensation. And they've done a super job so far. There's no question about that.
So we'll end here.
There's just one point, 2 points if I... Okay, let the questions come, then I'll conclude with 1 or 2 thoughts. Yeah.
Thank you very much, sir. It was absolutely fascinating. And I'm sure there would be some questions from the audience.
My name is GB Bagai. I have 2 questions actually. One is a general question on what Mr. Chandra thinks about the fact that a lot of people think that we have been slaves for 1,000 years. Since your own family has been associated with the British, your father was in the ICS and all, and you have had all that education. Do you feel that in the years that we were under the British, we were treated like slaves, or were we relatively autonomous and it's only certain sections and the economy suffered, of course? That is one question. And the other question is, what do the average Pakistani think about partition? Are they so concerned now that their country is deteriorating, as you said? And do they think that partition was a mistake? Or because when you watch Pakistani plays, for instance, they seldom refer to the city. They always talk about Pakistan aaye the, Pakistan gaye the. When they talk about, interactions with the rest of the world.
Ambassador Ronan Sen is the person who told me when he was ambassador to Germany, and I had gone with a top secret document, and I told him that, I said, sir, I need to put this in the embassy locker. So he says, what on earth for? Put it in your suitcase and don't lock it. So I said, really, sir? Why should I do that? He said, so that the Germans know what our bottom line is. So he's a very dangerous diplomat. So you have the floor.
No, I don't want to get into all of that, but I think some of the things, particularly on Kargil, it was very frustrating to, because we didn't get the mileage, because it was self-imposed that you will not, keep within limits. And even if you had, let's say, the knowledge of what happened in the past, you are not able to superimpose that. And that has happened repeatedly. Like, for instance, in the Maldives operations. We had nothing. We didn't even have the maps. So the question is, and right now it's being addressed, there are no easy solutions. But at that time, for that huge restriction, you didn't get any credit. It was just taken for granted by everybody. So have you any views on how the situation has changed? Because, it was not cut and dry. In the Cold War period, it was much more complicated. Because, for instance, the restrictions which we faced in Simla, the maximum constraints were placed by the Soviets.
My name is Darpan Majumdar. I run an initiative called Center for the Dialogue. Ambassador Chandra, I think one of the questions I have for you, obviously the world has become much more complex, as you mentioned. I think over a period of time, obviously, there used to be, whatever I heard, whenever there were these complexities, there used to be a lot of dialogue. I'm not pronouncing it because I work on dialogue. But the dialogue seems to have become, even if you're different, you have a different opinion. People, whether it's a head of states or they are not head of states, there used to be dialogue. I think the dialogue slowly and gradually has reduced tremendously over a period of time. And what do you see the future going? Because without dialogue, how do you even forget about resolution, but just to listen to each other? Do you see that as, is there a meta underneath that? What is the reason that there are no dialogues which are happening between the two parties?
Okay. First, let me start with the slaves' thought. Look, all colonialism anywhere is bad. I've seen it not only here, but I've seen it in North Africa as well, in Algeria. And any colonial power dominates, and that domination is terrible for the country which is suffering it. And in that context, yes, you may say the British did the railways, did canal irrigation, they provided a good civil service as well. But look at the amount of damage they did to your industrial development. And I don't have to go very far. If you look at the famines which were induced by them in the 40s, it is almost genocide. So colonial rule per se bad, does huge damage. What they did for India was for themselves, actually, to maintain their rule. So, I have very clear thoughts on that one, that I think this colonial rule was very bad, and also it bred a mindset which actually led us away from our own culture. And frankly, I have to admit this, I learnt of this only about 2 decades ago, because the education that I had was faulty. I went to a Christian Brothers school, which is a very good school, actually, otherwise, normally. I went to a Christian college, which was also very good, and, Delhi's elite goes there most of the time, or much of the time. But The point is, what did we learn there? We did not learn anything about our culture. What little we picked up on culture was from home. But we were not taught that. We were not taught even nationalism. So, I mean, they bred a mindset which was disastrous, actually, for the nation. The other point you made, what do the Pakistanis think? I think the basic, every Pakistani, if you scratch, you have to scratch a little bit because they are the most hospitable guys in the world. The hospitality that I have had in Pakistan, and I think most Indians who go there for a short visit particularly, have a fantastic time. They are superb hosts. People say the Punjabi Pakistani is the best. I'll just differ with that. It's actually the Pathan Pakistani who's even better. But the point is they are wonderful hosts. They put to shame anyone else's hospitality. But once you scratch beneath the surface, they would like to see India going down. And I can narrate two very quick stories. One is of a lady who had come to Delhi, and one of my colleagues from the High Commission was sitting next to her or behind her. And she had been waxing eloquent कि मैंने कितनी shopping की दिल्ली में and all the rest of it. अरे शुक्र है अल्लाह में हम पहुंच गए वापस अपने मुल्क में. You know, that sort of throws, we've had a good time there, now we are here. The second thought is, do India down. I mean, that element is there. So I don't think there is, you know, also on partition, unlike in what became Pakistan, where all Hindus and Sikhs and minorities were deliberately driven out, from India, some of the Muslims that went came back. Actually were persuaded to come back and given facilities to return to India. People don't recognize this. So, you know, Pakistan is a completely different story from ourselves. The culture is similar, it's a lot of fun and all that, but it's another story. Yes, Ronan, you're right on Shimla and Kargil, etc. Shimla, you're absolutely right that there were pressures on us. But I don't agree that we should have heeded those pressures, and I'll give you the area where we should not have heeded those pressures, because this was really after Shimla, is on the issue of the 195 POW war criminals, which the Bangladeshis wished to try. And we actually pressurized them to give up those trials. And we also returned the land without a quid pro quo. I think we should have got something. At least if you don't want to, you know, get the territory POK back to India, at least sort it out along the LOC and finalize it. So I think we missed it. On Kargil, frankly, I don't know at the heights, and now I'm not thinking of this side, I'm thinking on the other side on Ladakh. Frankly, I don't know. But Arvind, who has been interacting a lot with our military, will have a better answer to this. And finally, on the dialogue, yes, you're presumably talking about India-Pakistan dialogue, that it's not taking place, it is reduced. Yes, it is reduced. But tell me, how can you have a meaningful dialogue with a country which is day in and day out exporting terror? It continues to this day. Which is day in and day out trying to do you down and undermine you in many ways. So where does this dialogue, you know, I have been at track twos and so on occasionally, though I don't think they are meaningful because nothing comes out of that. And it doesn't make a difference. And the sad thing is that some of my friends in the Foreign Service, and I have many who are very good friends and very good colleagues who have a diametrically opposed view to me and somewhat a similar view to yourself, that, civil society. I have my grave doubts about civil society in Pakistan also. I think the brainwashing that has gone on in Pakistan over the decades is huge. And the young people there, their minds have been changed. So I don't see dialogue leading anywhere, and that's why my revolutionary and drastic solution is, let us facilitate the process of this country from going down the tubes. So that is my solution. I'd like to say a few concluding words after you finish.
Finished.
Okay. So once again, just to thank you and to conclude by saying that this book that has been written is of a career which is not an extraordinary career. It's a pretty standard career in the Foreign Service, in the sense that it's followed the Foreign Service posting pattern of assignments, which is you do some hard station and some soft stations and some B stations. I did an equal number of all of them, so I fit that category. Also the pattern that you do 2 postings out and 1 in India. The only area where I have been different, really, is that 25% of my career has been outside my own service. 5 years of it was spent with the Department of Economic Affairs, partly in Delhi and partly in Washington, D.C. And 5 years with the PMO, which is the NSCS. So I say this for the younger lot here, that my career is a typical pattern, really. It's the norm in the Foreign Service, so it's not an unusual career. And really, those of you who should think of a career should opt for this. And finally, since Bhaswati mentioned the human rights thing, and she played a very important role, and I'm glad she said many of the things she said. But 1 or 2 things to set it in perspective. My going to New York, it's very funny. I had 3 assignments at the same time on the same dates. One was the G15 meeting in Delhi, which was headed by our Prime Minister, Mr. Narasimha Rao. One was a meeting on human rights in Geneva, and one was the Disarmament Commission in New York. So I had to take a call, which I cleared, of course, of where I go. My option was ab initio, always New York. Reason being that our delegation in the G15 was out of the picture. We had a very senior officer, much senior to me, who was a secretary who was leading our delegation. And the G15 for me was relatively peripheral at that point in time. Geneva was very important, but our delegation was being led by Mr. L.M. Singhvi, who was our High Commissioner in London at that time. And he is a very eminent person, very knowledgeable on human rights, a wonderful lawyer and so on, with huge contacts. Madame Varvazi, whom she referred to, was a great pal of his. So I was sure things were in good hands. The Disarmament Commission was critical for me because there were 3 issues which were going to come up in it. One was Pakistan related, which was on regional disarmament, where they were doing a paper which I wanted to demolish because I did not want to get into a situation where we are being equated with Pakistan. So I suggested to Delhi, and Delhi usually used to agree with me. I mean, I must say hats off to headquarters. They were very understanding and supportive of me generally. And they said, yes, you go to New York. And then what happened in New York, partly she related, is I got a frantic call from the Foreign Secretary, who was a very dear friend of mine and my mentor, Mr. Dixit, and I owe a great deal in life to him, personally and officially. And he was livid. He said, this is what has happened in Geneva. So I said, okay, let me check and I'll call. He said, leave immediately for Delhi, for Geneva. So I said, let me check, I'll call you back. So I spoke to Dr. Singhvi. I spoke to my deputy there who was handling this. And I found the state of play, and which was that I won't be able to do anything. And my deputy told me, and this was the point which she made, that this is now in square brackets. So I called back Foreign Secretary Dixit, and I said, sir, my going to Geneva now is counterproductive, because what has to be done in Geneva has been done. It's a fait accompli. You cannot do anything. Nothing can be changed. Happily, the language is in square brackets. And I can guarantee you there will be no human rights declaration from the Vienna conference as long as the offending paragraph remains. And my remaining in New York for the next week is essential, because we are winning here, and we will win. So we got a paper on regional disarmament, which I wanted, and which kept the Pakistanis down on that issue. And I came back to Geneva, and then we went to Vienna for the World Human Rights Conference, and I was made the chairman of our negotiating group, not out of any other consideration, because there were others much senior to me. Hamid was there, for instance, but because I had to fulfill an assurance to the Foreign Secretary, which was to get the offending paragraph off. So what did I do? My reading on Saboya, who was a friend, is a little different from Bhaswati's. I felt Saboya, though he wasn't dealing with it in that capacity in Geneva, had to be disciplined a little bit. So I wanted to make sure that the Indian delegation is never again ignored for any reason. On the very first day, I raised 6 points of order in the discussion. The discussions were interrupted, and I raised points of order repeatedly. And the end result was, at one point, Saboya, who was looking nervous, said, now, Mr. Chairman, he addressed me as Mr. Chairman. And that is what I wanted. I wanted a guarantee that now whatever is done on the document has India's clear approval and is not done without our approval. And thereafter, I told him in an aside over coffee, I said, look, Ambassador, we are friends, but I can guarantee you that there will not be a document. India will not agree to any language as long as this thing on self-determination exists. We had meanwhile introduced many other things. We had introduced 6 paragraphs on terrorism. We had done all sorts of other things to fix the Pakistanis. But self-determination, as she said, is critical. And she is right. Absolutely right, Bhaswati, that in a very early morning session, and that's why I didn't sleep for 3 weeks. That's what the Foreign Service is all about. It's every night I was there, because I didn't know which night it will come up after a certain stage. So my happy hunting ground, which was Vienna, which I love that city to this day, I couldn't see it on that 3-week visit. But this is what the service is all about, that there is a certain commitment. You have to do a job, and you will do anything to ensure, and this is true of all the colleagues that I have here from the Foreign Service today, because that's what they bring to the table. And that is what makes me so proud of being associated with all of you. Thank you very much. Sorry, guys.
Thank you all for being here and for listening to one of the most fascinating narratives from one of our best diplomats. And thank you, sir. And there are a lot of people who want you to sign the book, including myself. So thank you.